My name is Travis Dixon. I am the David L. Swanson Professor of Communication and Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
My name is Dr. David Stamps. I'm an assistant professor at Bentley University in the Experience Design Department, where I teach public relations and study media psychology.
Okay, so as I was mentioning in the earlier symposium, I think for me that came when I was an undergraduate at UCLA and I experienced a ton of microaggressions and racism at orientation. And as I experienced those microaggressions and racism, what I realized was that much of it was driven by media, media effects, media consumption by my roommates, by my counselors. And I began really thinking about this area of media effects. I mean, I went to the library, I never forget this. I went to the library and I began trying to look up work on the impact of the media on stereotyping. And I literally could only find 1 or 2 articles on the topic. And I thought, this can't be the case, right? Like somebody must have done research on this. I must not be looking in the right place. And I would constantly go searching for this. And as I matriculated through the university, I realized this is something I wanted to pursue professionally. I wanted to study the topic. I would actually spend time as an undergraduate writing about it. So every paper was a race and media paper. Somehow I turned into a race and media paper every time. So that was kind of how I got started, really thinking about it systematically. And eventually I went to grad school and got trained in how to actually do the research the right way.
My path to get here was very different, I guess. So when I was an undergrad, I wanted to be a dancer.
Okay.
Point blank period, and so when I was getting ready to end my undergraduate career, I was actually traveling and touring with 2 different dance companies. So I was Joe Hall Dancers, which is an Afro-Caribbean company based out of Chicago, and with Culture Shock, which is a hip-hop international company. So I was traveling and touring throughout the Midwest. I was a dancer. I left Chicago, moved to Los Angeles, and started doing commercials and television shows and film work, and was in front of the camera for about 6 or 7 years. Then I needed health insurance, so I got a job, and I happened to be working in publicity for Universal Pictures. So I was working behind the camera, so I was on movie sets and TV shows, catching B-roll and working with talent and journalists. So I had worked in front of the camera and behind the camera. And then when I decided to go back to school to get my master's and my PhD, media was just a natural thing for me. I enjoyed media a great deal. So now I got to take a different look at it. And so I didn't have a specific angle of what I wanted to study. I just knew I wanted to bring myself to the conversation. So my identities, my race, my gender, my sexuality, my social position, that's what drove what I wanted to investigate. I wanted to see me represented because I'm a narcissist. And so dancing and acting and working in PR, media was just kind of this really fun, exciting thing to engage in. Having been in Los Angeles for 19 years, because I ended up doing my PhD and my master's in California as well as working in the industry, it was just fun. What I soon learned as a graduate student was what it felt to be vilified, what it felt to be on the margins, to be an outlier when it comes to quantitative research. And then that sparked the interest in me of making sure that we are represented. And so I started to write and produce work because no one else was producing the stuff I wanted to talk about, and I needed someone to cite. And so even now, my favorite thing when I get a review of my work, well, you cited Stamps 2021 wrong. And I'm like, that's interesting because I'm Stamps. And so, but 10 years ago, I was like, how come no one's studying how A affects B and how B affects C under this theoretical framework? And I was like, well, if no one's doing it, I'll do it. And now I can build on that. And so I came into media because it was this jovial place, and I started studying identity and its relationship to the impact on audience members because I didn't see it in the same vein. And I wanted to see more of me represented in that space.
One of the things I studied early on was news representation and bias, if you will, in terms of criminality. And what I found in that early work is that African Americans are greatly overrepresented as perpetrators. In fact, in the first study that I published, it actually came out of my dissertation, and that first publication indicated that African Americans were kind of the worst off of all 3 groups: African Americans, whites, and Latinos. So they were overrepresented as perpetrators. They were kind of somewhat fairly represented as officers, but they were also like overrepresented as violent perpetrators, underrepresented in more positive roles. I mean, it was just bad. And what I did was I replicated the work. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Before I get to the replication, I had a meeting with news producers maybe about 3 to 4 years after the publication. It was somewhat well cited at that time, and I was actually asked by USC to meet with producers and talk about like what was going on. And I'm like, yeah, are you all aware of this pattern? And we had some real conversation about it back and forth. And then when I tried to replicate the work several years later, like 10 years later, I found that that pattern was different. I actually found that representation of African Americans had improved over that 10, 15-year period from the first study to the replication. And I think it had a little bit to do with that discussion and other public discussion about race, making it into the mainstream that began to make them think more critically about how they were representing things. The other thing that I would use is I had an opportunity to work with the Rand Corporation. And in this particular case, they were working with the city of Cincinnati under a consent decree because they had a problem with policing in their city. And in this particular study, what we did was we did a content analysis of body cam footage, looking at the interactions between suspects and officers. And so we had an immediate impact there, right? Like after we actually finished the study, certain people got fired because what we found was that they were interacting in a very biased way, depending upon the race of the suspect. And so those will be the two examples I can think of from my own work that answer your question.
And that's amazing. Do you have any?
I haven't gotten anyone fired yet, but I'm going to try.
Right.
I actually, during COVID, I really wanted to do research that spoke to lived experiences that were rich and real in that space. And so I found myself at home, like most people did, asking how can I use the tools that I have to elevate voices. And so I actually started engaging with Black small businesses and with different Black folks. So how are you connecting? How are you staying sane? How are you using this time right now to build more community, especially because this was also around a time of a lot of protests. People were putting on masks and going out in the streets, willing to put their health on the line to make sure that their lived experiences were being elevated and the conversation wasn't going to go sideways because they were stuck at home. And so I had produced a few pieces. I had worked closely with the governor of Louisiana at the time. I was in Baton Rouge. And I was able to take those narratives back to the governor, back to his team. Had a chance to sit down with the mayor of Shreveport and talk about like, here's how people are using digital media to stay connected. And he said to me, I think that's great, but did you know that in Shreveport, only 25% of my residents actually have Wi-Fi and digital access in their homes. And most libraries in Shreveport have one computer. You get 10 minutes a day, once a day. And so this rich, thoughtful conversation was starting to take place, and the data was able to help engage in that conversation. It's always nice when like you get called by a news station, they want to come and interview you, or they want to have you in front of a couple of Black business owners and talk about how media and digital media has helped close some of the gaps when it comes to PPP loans and things along those lines. And so it's nice when your research and when your interests can kind of align with what's happening in society and what's trending right now, and help to add to the many voices that always deserve to get heard and deserve to have a seat at the table, but you were able to help kind of like push the door open a little bit more. Or because of the privilege of being a professor, of being a published author, you get to sit at the table. So now you take that time to elevate the voices that are not there. And so that was one such example. So it was nice to have the governor's ear. It was nice to have mayor's ears and to say, so here's the lived experience of your constituents. Here's what they need, here's what they want, and here's how they're thriving despite you. Step up and do better.
And I can really appreciate that because, and the reason why I wanted to actually ask you guys is because oftentimes there is this disconnect between research and then the real world, right? And so it's valuable to hear that there is that connection, or you have seen that connection and been fruitful in that. And so I just like to point that out because oftentimes we'll feel like we have to sit on one side. So either sit on the research, do the research, or try to be active in that advocate in the practical world. And so it's good to find times and areas where that can overlap. So I appreciate your perspective.
So I take all of my identities. So I am black, I am queer, I am a father, I am an academic, I am unapologetic, I'm atheist. Like the list is long. And so I'll produce research that looks at identities and how they're being represented. And I believe in quality over quantity. And so I want to talk about the nuance of characters and what does it mean for their existence when they talk about their mental health and their sexual health. I'll look at quantitative studies where I'll look at a specific audience, and I make the argument that in 2024 you can curate a media diet where you see yourself.
Right.
You can avoid some harmful depictions that Dixon's work really highlights, you know, and what might that look like? And so, and I am honest, I believe that our identities matter in the research. I was told in graduate school that, especially if you're a quant scholar, that you're removed from that, and that's false. I remember in defending my dissertation and going through my qual exams, and I knew, as much as I respect, when I did my qual exams, as much as I respect my colleagues, I knew someone was going to ask about that. And I said, and this was a proud moment, like I was about to burn it down. And I said, so if you think as a quant scholar that your identities and how you're socialized doesn't matter, I guarantee you're lying. And it was like, how so? And I was like, because you chose the theory. You chose the variables. You chose what actual analyses to run. There's a plethora of opportunities, but you chose specific ones. So you clearly impacted that study, as we all do. Because I can list 3 other theories, 5 other analyses that you could have done, but you didn't. So make it make sense. If you chose what you're going to do, what do you mean you're far removed from that? And the room got really quiet, and my advisor smiled. She was like, "You gonna fail?" But that was, but that's the reality of it. And so I bring my full self into it. And I had a full circle moment. One of my, I guess, colleagues at UCSB, where we both did our PhDs, but he said to me, "David, you have a piece right now, and my students are reading it." And I was like, "Oh, cool." And he was like, "And what I like most about it, in your methods section, you acknowledge your identities and how they impact what you're studying. How you are amplifying identities that align with you, and you're making space for identities that are foreign to you, and that's okay." And he was like, "And so I tell my students when we read this paper, what does it mean to bring yourself into the work?" And I was like, "Andy, thank you." And I've been encouraged by reviewers, I've been encouraged by editors, I've been encouraged by my peers. So like, yeah, a little bit of like self-perspective is not gonna hurt that conversation. And for scholars who think that that's not a thing, I will absolutely die on that hill. Like, I don't care if you're quant, qual, or critical, you name it, you bring yourself to the work. Even if it's just how you were socialized in your grad program. Yep. That's what you bring to the work. That's a choice, and that's a choice that's personal to you. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it matters.
Right. I completely agree. And just to maybe provide a follow-up, how does that take an emotional toll on you? So constantly having to maybe navigate or explain why you're bringing your full self, your identity to work, does that ever take a burden on you, or have you kind of just become comfortable with it?
I'll be sure with it. I love it. I love me.
Yeah.
I walk into a space and I promise I won't be long-winded. Here's the thing, I can't control what people think, how they feel in regards to my identities. I can't. I tell people all the time, like, you can't control someone's response, reaction to you, nor should you have to navigate that. But what you can be is your full self. Show up unapologetically and know that you're more than enough. And so I'm not gonna tell you that without embracing it and showing you what it looks like. And what I've learned in my own life is that my students, my own biological children, when they see it, they start to embrace it and realize. Can you imagine if we lived in a world where we all knew we were more than enough, what that would look like in our research and our friendships and in our workspaces? And so I don't mind bringing my full self, because if you don't like me after I bring my full self in, you aren't gonna like me to begin with. I still gotta keep it pushing.
Yep, I agree. And you, Dr. Dixon, sorry. How does your identity come into play with your research or the toll that it may bring?
I think one of the things I wanted to emphasize, because David says a lot of great things, but the one thing I want to add is that as you're moving through these spaces and as you're encountering, resistance and microaggressions and racism and all the stuff you're going to get, remember who you are. My colleague used to say, remember who you are and remember whose you are, okay? And so part of that for me means, who is my community? Who's going to fill my cup? Who's going to fill my cultural cup? who's going to fill my, my academic cup, and the people who are going to pour into me and help me, I'm going to gravitate to. The people who don't, I'm going to ignore. And I was talking to a student about some challenges she was having recently in the last couple of weeks, and my wife says I have this little bit of a superpower, because if you really are hating, I just don't let you into I mentally don't let you have that space in time. And like, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's what you're going to do. Well, then I don't have space for that. And if it's now, obviously, really constructive critique and criticism and all, that we like that as scholars. I'm talking about those people who are microaggressing, the racist stuff, the whatever stuff. I was like, I don't have time for that. What I have to do now is just keep moving, and not let you deter me and get into my head, because if I do, then I'm hurt. I'm internalizing. I'm letting that influence me. Okay. And so, I was talking to my wife. She was like, how do you do that? You don't care about people. It's like, I care about people. If they're going to partner with me and work with me and pour into me, cool. But if they're not, then no, not really. I'm not going to give them more energy. And I think that that's really important. A lot of times we also make people more powerful than they really are. One of the things I pointed out in the situation I was talking to somebody is, like, sometimes people are saying things to you because they want to get a reaction. They know you'll give it. And so then it's like, oh yeah, let me just go ahead and push your button. And if they know they won't get that reaction, you know what? They're going to leave you alone. Like, okay, well, he's not going to be moved by me saying this, so I guess I won't say that. Yep. So yeah, that's how I think. Build your community and ignore the crazy people. I would say that two things, right, immediately jump out to me. Obviously, emerging media is going to continue to be at the center of our lives. It's transforming the way that we consume media. It's transforming the way that we interact with media and think about media effects. I mean, everything has kind of been transformed in the last 20 years if you think about our digital world in which we now live. So that's going to obviously continue to be where we focus the next 20 years, and AI and algorithms just make all of it worse. So there's that. But there's another thing that's happened, in my view, that I see occurring, and I see it occurring with something that I'm interested in. I'm starting to see other students interested in the same topic, which is looking at emotion. This came up in one of the topics today, but I think that there was a cognitive paradigm that came out of psychology for decades, and it kind of really began to dominate our way of thinking about media effects. And I think it probably overly dominated. I think that we probably started ignoring the role of emotion and feeling in media effects. And I think that we need to return to that. And some scholars are beginning to do that, but I really think that, like, as an area, we need to begin to think about Black joy, anger, sadness, happiness. What is driving that emotional outcome? And then the third thing for me is we've also been pretty gloom and doom. This area is full of gloom and doom, full of like, oh, this is all the horrible stuff that's happening. It's horrible. So we need to start thinking, how do we counteract those things? Like, right? So how do we actually, using the tools we have, thinking about the 21st century tools we have, thinking about the emerging media phenomena, how do we actually create social movements? How do we create more peace? How do we create less stereotyping? I think those are the emerging new questions that we need to address.
Perfect. What about you?
I think, and this may be a presumptuous, I think I am an early career, young, burgeoning scholar.
Okay.
And so what I'm interested in, what I would love to see other scholars engage with, is just intersectionality. Mm-hmm. Audiences are not homogenous. So when we talk about Black audiences, Latino audiences, queer audiences, disabled audiences, we have to look at class and geographic location and sexuality and religion or lack thereof. And so I don't want to know what are young Black people watching. I'm looking at age and race, or what are queer Latino people watching, because it looks very different. I truly believe now, thanks to digital emerging media, we can create a media diet that specifically tailors to our different identities. So can we get more explicit and specific in that? And then to build on what Dr. Dixon mentioned, when we think about emerging in digital medias, we also have to think about literacy. So it's one thing to say people are now watching streaming services and they're now getting their news from HuffPost. What if you don't have access to those tools and you have the literacy skills to engage with them? COVID highlighted the haves and the have-nots. And so that's a social justice issue. So it's one thing to say, everybody getting their news from Facebook and TikTok and X right now. Not if you ain't got a phone and you can't pay your phone bill, or you live in a digital desert and you're not getting Wi-Fi. And so we can't have that conversation, because then we are erasing the majority of the global population when we talk about audiences in digital media, because majority of the global population does not have access to those tools. And a large percentage that do don't use it to just watch dance videos on TikTok. They use it to like build relations with their family and to get access to resources like their SSI check and like, you know, federal aid. And so I love when people like, let's talk about social media and digital media. And the first thing I say, start with who ain't got access. Tell me how we're gonna fix that problem. Because you think everyone looks like you, and that's not true. Yes, most of us in this room have smartphones and we're very savvy and what we call digital natives. I'm interested in the have-nots, the folks on the margins, the folks that are usually the outliers. Interestingly, they're actually the majority. And so if this is the direction that we're going in society, I want to bring everyone along for the ride. That is my job as a scholar who's also an activist. And so I care about the formerly incarcerated who missed out on the digital renaissance. I care about 65-plus-year-olds who can't engage because of, you know, the arthritis in their hands or needing reading glasses, which some of my research highlights, that there's actually physical impediments that keep them from fully engaging. And so if emerging media is the new thing, I'm interested in who's being left out. And that's something that we cannot discount, because then we're just reproducing the things that brought us to this, how we were vilified and ostracized and outliers because we weren't thought of. I don't want to reproduce that with communities going forward.
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm working on a couple of different things related to my model, the social media stereotyping model. One of those projects involves a collaboration with my former graduate student, Marissa Smith, who I'm very proud of. And we're looking at election coverage and social media usage and the way in which Kamala's identity intersects with the identity of viewers and news consumers to influence not only their support, but their ideas about racial identity and other issues that are related. So I'm really excited about this project. It is an election project. I don't normally do election projects. So yes, exactly. It's tricky. The election messed up a lot of researchers who were looking at Biden and Trump. And obviously now with the switch of the ticket, there's very interesting things happening with these intersections. You know, black women Democrats, black male Republicans, you know, black conservatives. So these are really interesting questions that we're trying to address in the current project, and I'm very excited about it.
Sounds exciting.
And I actually shifted gears, so I'm still interested very much in media and resistance, but I found down this rabbit hole, thanks to COVID, about digital literacy and digital access. And so I launched a project last year where I looked at digital natives. So this group is arguably 12 to 25-year-olds who grew up with smartphones, who grew up swiping and using screens. And I look at them as our saviors. They're going to be the ones to thoughtfully engage with their grandparents and parents on how to use digital media. They're going to be the ones that are going to be able to thoughtfully engage in classrooms. And they're the reason why we're talking about AI in colleges, because they have the expectation and the expertise. We have to catch up. I'll tell you a small story and then I'll share news. I was in New York at the Nigerian consulate in Manhattan, getting ready to get my visa. So I'm sitting in a small room with like 15 other people. And the woman sitting next to me, who was probably 60, 70 years old, she looks at me and goes, "You, help me." And she gave me her phone and her credit card.
Oh, wow.
Stranger danger. I was like, "What do you need?" And she was like, "Set that up." And she had downloaded the Uber app but didn't know what to do with it. And she's like, "I need to get home." And so I opened up the Uber app. I was like, "Where do you live?" And she's just telling me all her information. And then I put in her credit card and her CVV number. And I'm like, and I'm anxious because people are like, "That must be her grandson." I'm like, "Nope, stranger."
Right.
That's what digital access and literacy looks like. She didn't know how to download it, but she needed to get home. And that's a human right, to be able to get around, be able to travel. And so that sparked the idea of like, what does literacy look like? What role do digital natives have to play with that? How is that a social justice issue that we can actually step up? And so over the past year, I was able to get a couple of grants to start doing some interviews and do some quant data collection. And the first piece just got accepted 2 days ago. So the first study out of it, looking specifically at AAPI digital natives, because Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are one of the most tech savvy and have the most accessibility to digital devices compared to other racial groups, and are more collectivistic compared to their white groups. And so how are they stepping into the space to support their grandparents and parents who there's language and geographic boundaries there. So there's a lot of rich context there. And so that piece was just accepted. So we're working on some more stuff. I got some more money. I love spending people's money.
Right. Who doesn't?
To really look at how we can address the digital divide and look at literacy. And I think one group that exists on the margins when it comes to the conversation of emerging in digital media are young people. Right now, the conversation is they have low esteem and they don't know how to turn away from screens. They don't have any friends anymore. And I'm like, I don't necessarily disagree with any of that, but I'm of the Sonia Livingston crowd of like, no, they are tech savvy digital natives who are doing things that we've never thought of. Let's reframe the conversation. When I was y'all's age, I hung out at Taco Bell in St. Louis, Missouri. Like, that was the spot. We went to the mall. Malls don't exist anymore. And now my children put on their VR and they play video games with their friends. I'm not going to crap on how he engages and builds relationships because it looks different than my own. As a scholar activist, I now get to thoughtfully engage in the ways in which he builds relationships, and the ways in which he may make the world a better place, and how his tech savviness can be actually lifted up in a really thoughtful way. And so this path I'm about 1.5 years into it. Luckily, people are throwing money at me, so I'm really excited to explore and to shine a light on what 12 to 25-year-olds are doing when it comes to addressing what I think is one of the biggest human rights issues right now. We are going to go deeper down the rabbit hole of immersion in digital media, and we're going to become more dependent on it. I don't want to leave anyone else behind, and I want to acknowledge those who are doing the work. And I think digital natives are one of those really important populations.
Better.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Inclusive.
Ooh, I love that. I love that.
Hi, my name is Srivi Ramasubramanian. I'm the director of CodeShift, the Collaboratory for Data Equity, Social Healing, Inclusive Futures and Transformation. Thanks for watching Chai with Srivi.